Yo, Culture Confederates and YouTubers! Welcome back to the channel, Culture Confederacy here. It's Tuesday. Why is that such a dirty word, Confederate? There's nothing dirty about it. A Confederate means you're part of a confederation. To consolidate. So at any rate, I want to share this article with you at KTAL 6, Shreveport, Louisiana. And this is an article by Dr. Gary Joyner, who's a PhD in history. He's a history professor at LSU. And he wants you to know that Shreveport was a major Confederate capital and why it still matters. But the funny thing about this article is he really doesn't tell you why it still matters that Shreveport at one time was a major Confederate capital. So let's get to this. By the way, if you're new, no fancy graphics, epic soundtracks, pretty boy camera angles. It's you, me, my smartphone, the news of the day, and this mission, this crusade to preserve great art, music, history, and culture. So he says here, Shreveport was the capital of the Confederate state of Louisiana from 1863, March of 1863, until the surrender to Union forces in June of 1865. The city also served as the Confederacy's Trans-Mississippi Forces headquarters, and the 20th century struggle for civil rights in the South, particularly in the Deep South, has its roots not in the late 19th century, but in the Civil War and the subsequent Reconstruction period. Well, wait a minute. I thought this article was about the city of Shreveport being a major Confederate capital and why it still matters that it was a major Confederate capital. You see what he's doing here, right? He's merging these two issues together. The Civil War was a conflict. Civil rights was a movement. Two separate things. Now, you can make the argument that there were certain things with the civil rights movement that came about because of the events that happened during the Civil War. But they're actually two separate issues. Civil War, a conflict, and civil rights, a movement. But he's trying to merge these together, you see. Well, he tries to tell you why it still matters that Shreveport was a major Confederate capital. So this is the introduction to a series of 8 articles now, that will pinpoint the locations of places key to Shreveport's involvement in the Civil War, including the city's Civil War POW camp or inner defense structures, the old naval yard where submarines were manufactured, a spy map that includes the locations of Union spies in Shreveport during the war, a map of the railroad lines that were active in Confederate Shreveport. I'm still waiting for you, Dr. Joyner, to tell me why it still matters that Shreveport at one time was a major Confederate capital. You're giving me a history lesson here. A plethora of facts about Confederate engineers who worked out of the city and an article on the importance of Tone's Bayou. Yes, this series will be a lot to digest, he admits, but understanding Shreveport's Confederate ties is crucial to understanding the civil rights movement that took place a mere 100 years after the end of the American Civil War. Again, the Civil War was a conflict. It was about preserving the Union, as Lincoln said. Had nothing to do with civil rights. It was all about preserving the Union. In fact, it had nothing really to do with slavery. It all came down to the Western territories. It really came down to power. The states wanting to reserve their rights as states, preserve those rights as states. A constitutional argument. That's what it was about. Why Shreveport Civil War history matters. He's going to tell us why it matters now. After 4 or 5 paragraphs have given us a history of Shreveport. New Orleans and Baton Rouge had been under federal Union control since 1862, so in 1863, the Confederates created a separate military department consisting of all lands they controlled west of the Mississippi River. Its capital was Shreveport. So what? Confederate Governor of Louisiana, Henry Watkins Allen, and the state legislature were in Shreveport. So what? The Confederate Army of the Trans-Mississippi was based in Shreveport. So freaking what? I'm still waiting for you, Dr. Joyner, to tell me why it still matters that Shreveport at one time was a major Confederate capital. What we now call the Arc-La-Tex was controlled by Confederate Shreveport. The state government in exile from Missouri was located first in Shreveport and then in Marshall, Texas, 40 miles west to the west of Shreveport, rather. Now let's back up for a moment. He talked about Baton Rouge. And I've talked about this several times before. In 1810, you had settlers in what is now modern-day Baton Rouge who wanted to start their own colony. Had they seceded, it would have been known as the state of Florida. It was a short-lived republic, the Republic of West Florida. And they asked the United States government at the time to recognize them as a colony, but the United States refused to do so because they did not want to get into a war with Spain because Spain controlled the area at the time. So what did these settlers do? They declared their independence from Spanish rule, and they raised for the first time the Bonnie Blue flag. That's a blue flag. It's got a navy blue field with one white star, and it's the root of the Confederate battle flag, the first star of the Confederate battle flag. That's where we get Hurrah for Southern Rights, Hurrah from, the song The Bonnie Blue. That's what that song is about. It's about these Southerners of the short-lived Republic of West Florida declaring their independence from Spanish rule. I'm surprised that Dr. Jordan doesn't know that, or he's not talking about that here in this article. He mentions Baton Rouge. The Confederate capital of Arkansas was located in Washington, Arkansas, 75 miles to the north of Shreveport. Shreveport was the only Confederate administrative center worth striking west of the Mississippi River. In fact, by late 1863, the Union High Command felt that there were only 4 targets of any consequence left in the Confederacy: Richmond, Atlanta, Mobile, and Shreveport. I'm still waiting for you, Dr. Jordan, to tell me why it still matters that Shreveport was a major Confederate capital. So let me skip through this for the sake of time. So he goes through nothing but a history lesson here. And he talks about the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. Let me get to that part here. Congress passed the Constitution's 3 so-called Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th Amendment freed enslaved people. However, it did allow for slavery in the case of criminal punishment. In fact, Colorado took out all its slave language, quote-unquote slave language, in its state constitution back in 2018. And believe it or not, I believe it was the state of Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken, because of an oversight. Now, when these states adopted the 13th Amendment, they were supposed to send that paperwork to the National Archive. Well, there was an oversight. The state of Mississippi didn't do it. So they were not officially a free state till I think it was 2013. Which just goes to show you how complex of an issue slavery was at the time. So the 13th Amendment freed enslaved people, but allowed for slave labor in the case of criminal punishment. But these did not necessarily secure people's rights, freed African Americans' rights, their place in society. And I can prove that here. Minnesota, which is not a southern state. This is at Minopedia, M-N-O-P-E-D-I-A. Talks here about how at Minopedia talks here about how African American women did not have the right to vote. They were disenfranchised. Let me read that part to you here. From their state's admission to the Union until the mid-1860s, a majority of Minnesotans advocated the abolition of slavery in the South. African American suffrage, however, did not enjoy the same support, and Minnesota's African American citizens paid taxes, fought in wars, and fostered their communities. But they could not vote, hold political office, or serve on juries. This continued until 1868, when an amendment to the state's constitution approved suffrage for all non-white men. However, the amendment did not apply to African American women, however, who continued to be disenfranchised, like I said, in Minnesota and the rest of the United States. Remember, we did not have the 19th Amendment, the right for women to vote, until 1920. So in the 19th century, you had newly freed African American slaves, women, and you had white women who could not vote. But a lot of freed black men could, white men could. This is at Minopedia site. And what about the anti-Chinese, anti-Irish sentiment? So if you go to the State Department site, State of the Historian, they talk about the Chinese immigration at the time in the 19th century and these Chinese Exclusion Acts. It says here, to address the rising social tensions from the 1850s through the 1870s, because of these newly arrived Chinese immigrants that were taking American jobs at the time, the California state government passed a series of measures aimed at Chinese residents, ranging from requiring special licenses for Chinese businesses or workers to preventing naturalization. Because anti-Chinese discrimination and efforts to stop Chinese immigration violated the 1868 Burlingame-Seward Treaty with China, the federal government was able to negate much of this legislation. And I mentioned this many times before. In 1862, Leland Stanford, who founded Stanford University, became governor of California in 1862. During his State of the State address, he called the Asians, the Chinese, an inferior race. In 1879, advocates of immigration restrictions succeeded in introducing and passing legislation in Congress to limit the number of Chinese arriving to 15 per ship or vessel. Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes vetoed the bill because it violated the U.S. treaty agreements with China. Nevertheless, it was still an important victory for advocates of exclusion. Democrats, led by supporters in the West, advocated for all-out exclusion of Chinese immigrants. This is at the State Department's State of the Historian site. Anti-Irish sentiment, anti-Italian sentiment. In 1882, 5 people were killed in the area of Menstranza. And The Spectator wrote a scathing article about this, calling these people who were murdered, calling the Irish peasants at the time uncivilized, comparing them to the Maoris and the Polynesians. This is all happening between the 1850s, 1870s, early 1880s. This is the post-Reconstruction period, or during Reconstruction. But I'm still waiting for Dr. Joyner here to explain to me in his article why it still matters that Shreveport was a major Confederate capital. He can't do it. He can't do it. So I thought I'd share this with you. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, you know what to do. You can follow me on Instagram, #JasonComposes, because I write music in my spare time. Or go to X, Culture Confederacy, Culture Confed1 on X. You can now find me at Substack as well. So wherever you find me there, you'll see me there. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like I said, I'll catch you next time, and you all have a great Tuesday. Take care.